nach Hatsiti, Ishqa, Dakdentan. Shirley Kendall, my name is Shirley, and my mother was a Chilkat, so we were Chilkats. My dad used to make sure that we took a trip to Haines every year. And when I was born, they went up there, and those of you who know about weaving would know who Applique is. She is a very famous elder, and she's also very well known for her weaving. And when she saw my mother carrying me, she asked to see me. And so when my mother took me over, she said, "I'm going to break a rule. Usually your name is not passed on until after you're gone." She said, "I'm still alive, but I'm going to give her my name." So that's how I got my name. And I'm not a weaver. I took a weaving class, and it looked like grade school weaving. So I know it takes a lot of work and practice to get that really beautiful work that the women today do. I think Applique also was one of the ladies that took apart a Simshan Chilkat blanket. And they took it apart to see how it was made. And so using the information from that, they were able to complete a blanket. And the interesting thing about Chilkat weaving is, and that's different from all the weavers in America, is that the weavers start from the top. The Chilkat weavers start from the top, and the other weavers will start from the bottom, and that's the case every single time except for the Chilkat weavers. So it's kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. But I just wanted to tell you about myself, and my mother and my father were very traditional in the way that they taught us. And I printed out a title to this class, and I called it Hints for Making a Traditional Blanket. And those of you that have made blankets, this will be a good refresher for you. And these are things that, the information that I have is studies that have been done by anthropologists on things that we make. And it's interesting that we all had to deal with the same kind of trade material. And what we did with it is what makes it truly Tlingit and Northwest Coast. When you go to the different tribes, they really have an identity of what they did with the fabric that they got in trade. And a good example, I think, is the kaspuks that the ladies up north made. I think it's really clever how they put the ruffle where the fur is on the other items, fur jackets that they have. So, Erna Gunther was somebody that was really, really interested. She was an anthropologist, and she was very, very interested in Northwest Coast, did a lot of studies. When I was a student at the University of and she'd be going across the campus. She would see me and say, "Come, take my arm and walk with me." So I would go and help her across the campus to wherever she was going. And she would tell me a lot of things about little things that didn't appear in her books. And she said that the Chilkat blanket, they were able to figure out why they had that particular shape that that they used for making the blanket. But she said they were unable to discover why we made the button blankets the way we do. They just know that it's very traditional from the very start when we got material. She said, she was always joking. She said the missionaries were very concerned about us, and they told the trade people, they said, next time you come, make sure you bring a lot of buttons. And because they were embarrassed about what we didn't have on under the fur robes. So they need to learn how to fasten their clothes. So when they brought buttons, the women bought them by the buckets and sewed them onto the blanket. So it was, that was her joke, and I don't know how true it is, but it's true that we really got taken by the items that were brought for us to use. And I wanted to show a lot of the blankets that were made, and these are historical blankets from the books by Erna Gunther, to show you the different ones that they had. And we have a few slides that we're going to show you. And I know you can see it better than I can. I tried to pick out blankets with different colors and the designs on them. I had the thought that the big designs that are now put on blankets is fairly a new idea, but it isn't. When you look at these old blankets, you will see that they did use buttons and applique to make their designs. So this is my assistant, my granddaughter, Kalinda. She's going to run the projector for us. And since this is an hour-long for us to talk about this, that we'll take comments and questions after, because I'll give the presentation, then we'll take questions afterwards.
Sorry in advance, most of the pictures doesn't work, so it doesn't show up. So sorry in advance.
This is a blanket that showed up in Nora Downhauer's book, and if you look through her books and you see this particular blanket is a true atu. We talk about atu, and you think, okay, I got a blanket, it's an atu, and but this one belonged to my aunt. Her name was Irene Young. She was married to Jim Young, and she was the sister to my dad. So she wanted a blanket made, and she hired my mom, and those of you that know Mary Johnson from Huna, she hired the two women to make her a blanket, but she didn't specify how it was going to be done. So So since my mom and Mary Johnson were not artists, they had to hire my dad, who was a Duckdainton, to make the design. So if you can see the pattern, Duckdainton, a woman hired 2 eagles to make her a blanket. They didn't know how to make a design, so they hired a Duckdainton to make the design. And this is a design he came up with. And there's a nest in the middle, the bigger piece. Oops. Okay, there's a nest, the big piece, and the 2 on the side, one on each side is a rock. Those are rocks. And then the sea turns at the top. So I remember my mom and Mary making plans on who's going to do what part. And Mary said, I'm going to do the smaller pieces because her hands were small. And they said, okay, so my mom did the bigger pieces. And after they finished, then they put it together. And the blanket is dedicated after it's finished before you can wear it. And so this is a really true boot. And I think we'll come back to this one later on to show you a little more about what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, the next one. No. 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 See the size of the buttons on that one? It's really amazing. And this, can someone tell me what the design is?
Thunderbird? Thunderbird.
Thunderbird. How can you tell? Thunderbird.
On top of thorns?
Curly ears. Usually the curly cute top. Otherwise it's an eagle. So this is Papi Shunga Katie blanket. Okay. This one looks like a not that one. I'm telling you.
I'll go to the frog one. Kind of looks like a frog.
This one is a bear. Does that look like a bear?
Bear or frog?
Oh no, it looks like
And then there's that one.
oh, that's somebody wearing wanted to show somebody wearing a blanket and how it
This
looks.
is it. Killer whale. Somebody
Killer
wearing-
whale. No, maybe a shark. Is it really that's a shark? Because of the pointed fin.
Yeah, he's spouting, good point.
Okay,
And I think that's the last one after
check the last one. I had quite a few more pictures, but what do they call it? A glitch? Usually, what was that? Wait. I need to turn that on. For now. Get that. The shape of the blanket is the shape of a regular blanket, and I think the women just took the size of a regular wool blanket. And we really took to the wool fabric, and some of the wool is really heavy, and then there's this really excellent wool that is lighter in weight and smaller buttons. So when I was sitting at home one time, and I like to watch black and white movies, the old movies. We have some chairs over here. You can chairs over here. Got enough chairs?
Anyone need a chair?
Okay. That one picture that saying about that. Show it next. Okay, I was sitting at home watching old movies, black and white movies, and this was long before the pause button came along. And it was a story about war between two sail ships, and you know how they ram each other to as they fight. And there's one ship, they rammed the other ship, and the sailors jumped aboard, and they were fighting. And all of a sudden, in the middle of everything, I saw something that made me fall out of my chair, and I couldn't, there was no way to pause the button, but boy, I sure do remember this. And Glenda kept showing it. So we'll look at it again, and I'll tell you what I saw. This is a military jacket. And you can see from looking at this that it's a red jacket with a black front and the buttons along the edge. And what I saw was one of these jackets. The only thing is it was black with white buttons. And I think what happened was when these gentlemen had a change of design or got worn out or something, they would put it in the rummage. And the sailors would dig through the rummage and cut off the tails. And they would have a short jacket, but they left everything else on there. So I think the Tlingit women, when they saw this, they decided to try it. And the reason I'm sure of this is when you look at the jacket, only the front and sides and around the neck is where the trim is. And that's exactly what our blankets look like, where we have only, I don't know if you ever thought about it or ever wondered why we had the sides and the top and nothing on the bottom. And when I told my mother I was getting married, she immediately got to work and made a blanket for my husband. And so she told me after she finished the blanket, before giving it to me, that this is what a button blanket, traditional button blanket, is supposed to look like. And this was very important. So, if we can get the lights on. Thank you. So keep in mind that jacket you just saw, and we have the blanket with the top. If you folded this up, it would look more like that jacket. There's the front with the buttons, and there's the neck, but nothing on the bottom, as you all know already without me telling you. But the important part of this is when you look at that jacket that I just showed you, is the front of the blanket, this trim, it ends before it hits the bottom. And when the tails of the jacket is cut off, you have this little bit of blue that shows on the bottom. And my mother said this was very important, that you have this like a half an inch or almost an inch on the bottom. So when you make your blanket, make sure you have this edge on your blanket to make it a traditional blanket. It's really important. So I think that we have really good examples of in the old blankets, and this is a blanket that was given to me by my brother, Kelly, those of you that know him. Let's get in the front of the table. This is a much heavier blanket. And you have that where the buttons end to indicate where the trim should be. And the weight of this, you see the police badge there. That was my brother's badge, and we put it on there with the brown bear design. But the those of you that already know that the red does not appear in the back, just in the front. And that's really a clever part of the women that made these blankets to begin with, that when they copied the jackets that they saw, and they made sure that the back of the blanket doesn't show any of the designs that they put on there. So it was a real educational thing for me. The anthropologists, they couldn't figure out why we did make this blanket the way we did. And then I saw the gentleman with the officer's jacket. And when you cut off the tails of that, that's what the sailors had on when they came up here to be among our people. And the women, I think they had the idea and just put it together so that this has become a very traditional blanket. And also, please be aware of the traditional way of getting a blanket made is you hire somebody from the opposite clan to make the blanket completely. Make the blanket. Don't have the blanket made and then give it to you to work on. Have them make the blanket, and the women, if they don't know how to make a design, then they can hire a raven. If their raven hired an eagle, the eagle can hire a raven. And then the blanket is dedicated at a party before using. Sometimes named. Some of the blankets have names. So this is a very important part of the presentation that you, that if you're making a blanket, please be aware to follow all the traditional uh, ways of doing this. If you have any questions or comments at this time, or
Yeah, I do.
yeah.
I missed out on this one that you were talking about right here.
Yeah.
On this part, what did you mean, the blanket has to have this?
Because when you look at the, I'm gonna put that command back. If I can figure out how to point out the jacket. So if you cut off the tail of the jacket, so you see where the buttons end?
Yeah.
If you cut off the tail, he has a tail here, which the sailors didn't want. So when you cut it off, it leaves that little edge of red.
So that's the reason for that little edge on the blanket
Yeah.
itself?
Yeah. So I've seen it on other officer jackets. There's actually a big book of these jackets, and they all look the same. Once the tails are cut off, that's what's left to make it into a small jacket. That edge is really important for you to do. And it's easy to correct if you made a blanket that goes all the way to the bottom. It's easy to correct it and make it.
Is that edge on that one, on the red and black one?
On the black one, it goes all the way to the bottom.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. So,
But the
this was a gift to me from my brother when he died, so it belonged to my youngest son who also died, so it's really valuable.
So what about the blankets with 3 buttons and everything? The on Yeti blankets?
3 buttons,
Yeah,
3 rows, you mean?
3 rows?
You know, I've heard a lot about this, and some of you might confirm it. Some people think that the more rows of buttons you have, the more important you are. But I'm kind of thinking that maybe the women who could afford a lot of buttons were doing.
No.
I'm not sure. Has anybody heard any different?
And the panel on the back,
Oh, that's a different kind of blanket. That one doesn't, it has a different name. It's not like a regular dance blanket.
That they on the Yeti blanket, Shirley?
Yeah. No comment?
Yeah, right there. Somebody,
Grandma Carrie.
Where?
Shirley,
Yeah.
remember when we had the dance group in Anchorage and all of this Koyaki, and
Yeah.
you told us more about the blankets, and you were telling us also that the early Russian traders and people that came in, the Clinkets, like you said, saw those, and they traded to get a lot of the designs, so they kind of got it from the Russians in a way, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know, the designs are so important to the Clinkets when we put it on our clothing, that nobody else can use it unless they have permission from the person. This blanket that belongs to my husband, who's at Updaintown, I occasionally wear it because it's his. And but it's a Updaintown blanket. This one's Kagwantan. Yeah.
I have a question. Did we take some of the material from those jackets and use them on our button robes? The red material from the jackets, were they cut up?
Oh, no, I think they were kind of a pattern, and probably the women were aware it was a lot of wool, so they began to use wool fabric too. And that's something that I also wanted to talk about was the colors, for some reason or other, the black blanket like this with the red trim is the most popular. When you see the grand entrance and the grand exit, a major number of them are black and red. But actually, we're not. The women were not restricted to just that color. There was some samples. I'm sorry that we didn't get all the blankets, and I wanted you to see. Some are blue, and it's creative. It's whatever material. And I think what used to happen with the women is if somebody gave you some material and you want to honor them, you can use that making a blanket, regardless of what color. So those of you that were brave enough to make blankets from orange and yellow, and you're okay. So, because it's traditional that the women were able to get all kinds of different fabrics to make these blankets.
So you're saying there's really no restriction to the color?
As far as I know, there isn't.
Yeah.
But the city clinkets, like Anchorage, we tend to, the city clinkets tend to use a black and a red. So you see a lot of it when you see the dancing.
So the size of the buttons and all that stuff, it's all up to the individual, or?
That's what you can get. Buttons are pretty hard to find. You go on Amazon and all kinds of different areas to look for buttons. And there are a lot of plastic buttons, and those are the kind of buttons I used when my grandchildren were small. They are pretty flashy, the plastic buttons. But it's a lightweight blanket. So when you feel this one, it's pretty heavy because of the weight of the buttons. So dentalium shell buttons are very, very hard to find. But I think you can locate it online if you look.
Shirley, during your visit to the Smithsonian, did you find button robes at the Smithsonian or examples at the Smithsonian?
They didn't show us any button blankets. I asked about it and they gave me a picture of one. I think it was green with the red trim.
Well, they didn't have button blankets there?
They had them, but they wanted us to specifically look at jackets
Oh, okay.
and shirts, yeah, and choke hat blankets. So I asked about it, but we didn't get to really look at them.
So Shirley, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Why does the button blanket have to be done by the opposite clan?
For making it a real ooh, that's how you do it. And there's a lot of people that were talking about, you have a dance group and they're going to go to celebration, everybody hurries and makes a blanket. A lot of the blankets are done that way now. So
if I hired a raven to make the blanket, would I, as an eagle, be able to do, I would be able to do the buttons or the design? How does that?
no, the blankets need to be completed
Okay.
by the people you hire. That's one of the first things they do anyway. And the beadwork is, or the applique, whichever way you want to do it. If you're making an applique, which is pretty interesting, you find a pattern that you like from a book, and a lot of it has really a lot of details, small little cutouts, little teeny pieces. What I do is I go to the shop and have it enlarged, big, cut it out, and leave a lot of details out of it to do an applique. So, you know, it's up to you if you want to do all the little cuts and stitch it down. Are there any other comments or questions? One thing I wanted to advise you on too, and it's because of my own experience, is if somebody comes to you with a package, everything is together for the size that they need, and the buttons and everything, and they hand it to you, make me a blanket. And I said, okay, so I took the material and I made a blanket and put the buttons on there. And when I finished it, gave it back to him, his girlfriend convinced him that I switched fabrics, that I stole the material and gave him a cheap. So make sure, because of my experience, when they bring you a package to say, make me a blanket out of all this, take it out and have them feel it and have them drape it. The material that I had to make a blanket from was gabardine. Wasn't wool. So he thought he had a heavier blanket, at least like this, and it wasn't. It was very, it draped very differently when you have that. He even went back to the person he bought the material from to say that I stole the material. And the person that sold it to him said, no, that's the same thing I sold you. So, but he still didn't believe it. So if they come to you and say, make me a blanket out of this, and it's in the package, take it out and feel it so that that they know that this is actually what they brought you, and that's what they're going to get back.
So gabardine isn't really, did it make a good blanket, gabardine?
It drapes quite differently than...
Meaning that it's stretched out or?
It doesn't stretch out. Gabardine is fairly good for making suits and things like that.
But it's not good for blankets, though?
I don't think so. There are some people that sell gabardine to make blankets, so it makes it. It will look different and it will drape differently. But I do also know that there are some people that line their blankets. And that's a neat idea. If you're dancing and you're really too hot, you can take that lining out and wash it so that you don't have to worry about dry cleaning. You can make sure that the material that you get is actually wool. Nowadays they don't sell really good wool to make blankets. They sell fabric that's looks like wool but isn't, and it gets fuzzy. You have to press it to keep it looking good, and it's hard to clean. With these blankets, I just do, the dry cleaner won't take a blanket like this with the beadwork and buttons. They don't want to handle it. So what I do is I have this bag, and you can put the dry cleaning cloth, put it in your dryer, and take it out and let it dry. So just be really careful with it. So the plastic buttons, and there's a lot of them that you can get. Don't be embarrassed about using it for your children because they grow fast. They grow really fast. So it's then the next blanket. What I do is take the applique from the blanket and put it on another one, so you can keep reusing it. So I want to talk about how, do you have any more comments or questions?
Question? Yeah. I was told that mother of pearl buttons were for women and abalone buttons were for men. I don't know if that's true or not.
I'm not sure that there is any rule like that that I've heard. This is a blanket my mom made for my husband, and these are shell buttons. So abalone is more expensive, and I think it really stands out beautifully if you can afford it. Get that many shell buttons. Was there anybody else?
Right here,
Yeah.
can I ask, how long does it take, how many hours go into one of those blankets?
Putting the edging on the blanket, it's pretty easy. You get done real fast. It's the buttons and the design. It takes time, depends on how many hours you want to spend on it. Harriet's daughter is in the other building, and she's running her sewing machine and talking and laughing with somebody else. That's about like my sister-in-law who knits and watches TV at the same time. I can't do it. Concentrate. So just depends on how much time you want to spend. So okay, celebration is 2 days. Can you make a blanket? So, and then I want to demonstrate how to measure for. Somebody told me they had a blanket made, and after the blanket was all done with all the buttons and their design, they couldn't even close the front. So, Kalinda, where is she?
Right here.
Okay.
The baby shoe fell off.
Just found a little friend here. Okay. I'm going to stand right here with their backs. So what you measure, if you can see it, you guys, is from the wrist to the wrist for the blanket. And it will go up, the red part will go up to probably the hairline. And how long you make it is according to what they want, but don't, if they say, oh, I want it longer than that, just remember they're going to be dancing in it. So it's really hard when you're dancing and you're dragging your blanket. Some people say, I want it longer than that. And say, you're making it, you advise them and say, just remember now when you dance, it's going to be a little more difficult if it's too long. So my problem was I made a blanket for my son, and he's 6'2". So when I made it and put it on, it was too short. So I had to take it apart. And then I had really good material, but not enough. So what I had to do, this is the top. What I did was I took the red top off, and then I added a heavy, real good cotton to the top to make it about 6 inches longer. And then I put the red top back on. So it was really something, but it turned out to be pretty good for him because he didn't like it when it was too short. So make sure you measure the person and make sure they agree. So since you're the advisor, make sure they know that it is too long or too short. And blankets can be passed on to others. So when you make that, keep that in mind. And I think the clever part of the making the blanket is, like this one's really getting worn out. Is the design that's on here, I can take it off and put it on something else, another blanket. If the blanket gets really worn out, then you can do that. And it's, I don't know if the women planned it that way, but that's the way it works. And the blanket that you saw that was done by my mom and Mary Johnson, those pieces were so perfectly made, but they can be taken off and put on another blanket if you need it.
Question?
Yeah.
I was told that if you bead directly on the cloth, that it's more valuable than if it's applique. Is that true?
It depends on who owns it and how they feel about it. It's kind of, Tlingit culture is kind of strange in the fact that the writers who wrote about us said that we are so structured. We have the people that are really upper class, and then there's a lower class. And when I read that, I said, yeah, I challenged them to find somebody that will say, oh yeah, I'm low class. Because they can prove it, that they are a very high class, who their grandparents are, where they come from, what they own, all these things, you know. So where'd they get that, you know? Somebody said to them, who was writing, oh yeah, I'm very high class, there's other people that are lower, you know. Yeah, I can say that, sure. But I challenge those writers to find a Tlingit that will say, yeah, I'm really low class. So there's no truth to that. I think we all can prove the structure of our family and where we come from. All those things are so important to our culture and our history, the history that we have kept about the people and our families. So are there any other comments?
I just have a little humor.
Okay.
Do you know the word for Tlingit dignitary?
What?
Tlingit dignitary, do you know the word for that?
No.
It's hot eh.
There is one thing that I want to point out. We were talking about beadwork, the beadwork class that I teach. And the interesting thing about Tlingit, and we are so creative. I always really admire the women that did the work, and it's really fantastic that when you look at the beadwork in the museum, you know which is Tlingit. How do you know that? Do you know? And which is Athabascan? Athabascan is pretty easy to recognize because they fill in. When they make a flower, they fill in everything. We didn't do that. And I want to show you on this jacket. This is my mother's work. And when you look at this, these flowers, you can tell what background there is. They didn't fill in beadwork entirely. They used the color of the fabric, the felt, to complete the design. So if you want to look at And this.
Okay. Somebody else wants to see the back end.
Here. And you can see how they use the background. And this
Yeah.
one here,
Do you see it?
what,
There's one on here.
yeah. I'm showing them the flowers, the kind of design that was made by the women in my mom. Yeah. There was a lot of things that my mom had that I just took them. They didn't match anything, so it's really beautiful and clever how they did the beadwork so that you can see the felt and all of them.
You ever make a blanket?
And so you don't have to work hard and fill in everything. So we're gonna pass it.
Then when I hold up the number.
Once you start, it's hard to stop.
What's that, Rick?
The beadwork is good too.
So,
It's just one.
do you have any comments about beadwork
Oh, yeah.
or designs that,
Yeah, Shirley, I have a
Yeah.
question. So, I know you talked about it earlier, but how do you go about cleaning a vest or cleaning a blanket again?
the dry cleaners will not take it.
Right.
So there is a dry cleaning kit that you can buy from the store, grocery store. And there's a bag, it's kind of like a big plastic bag. Just fold everything and put it in there. Put the cloth in with it and put it in the dryer. And it really refreshes everything. After we do a lot of dancing, that's what I do to our blanket. It won't be dry when you take it out, so you have to kind of lay it out and let it dry.
The other question, Shirley, is you mentioned how to measure. How do you measure again?
Okay.
I know wrist to wrist, but
Wrist to wrist.
how do you measure up and down?
So the length of it is probably down to the ankles or a little higher, depending on who it is. And are you talking about the edging?
Yes.
Where's the blue one? When we looked at the items at the Smithsonian, what amazed me was how the women were able to figure out, I don't know what my mom used, a yardstick or fingers or something to make the edging. For an adult, you need about 8 or 9 inches wide. For a child, you can just eyeball it, look at it see how it looks. But the straight cut and the straight, how did they do it? With the sewing machines that they had, probably the kind you crank for the really old things that they had. But those were really tailored shirts. And somebody said something about these shirts. I think they were made to fit one person. So it was really hard to hand it down to other people. And all the designs on the edge of the trim and the cuffs, those are all removable. They're made so that you can just take it off and put it on something else. So, you know, did they think that out? I think they did. They just wanted to make sure that they had some of that stuff that's hard to make, the beadwork, so that it's transferable to something else. So yes.
Shirley, celebration, I noticed that some people put something new on their robe every year. Like, one year it will look kind of plain, and the next year maybe it'll have paw prints on the edging, or bear paw prints, or other kind of cutouts and things like that. So every time you see their blanket, it's more embellished and more embellished. Is that new?
Yeah, I think that is, it's, maybe they started using it when it was incomplete and wanted to add the other items. When you look at the designs that I showed, those were all one piece. There was no pieces that were, except for the sea tern blanket where it was a nest and 2 rocks and a bird. Most of them were like a big killer whale or a big bear or thunderbird.
There's a question in the back.
Okay. Question?
Could you talk a little bit about the beadwork designs? I think that I've heard that some of them are associated with seaweed, and I'm wondering, are there specific kinds of flowers that are beaded, or is it that specific?
I think it's a choice of the person. There's some people will do a applique and add buttons to the outline, or just an applique with, I've seen a very well done appliques without any other embellishment. The beadwork, usually you can add it to the outline usually of whatever you're making. It just depends on the designer. Anybody else? So if anybody knows where to get dentalium shell buttons or order buttons, I somehow got a big box of buttons from somewhere that were shell buttons. If you go to AFN, I think there's people that have stuff like that.
I actually have a blanket that has shells on it.
What kind of shells?
I don't remember it. I think my Uncle Dan that died a few years ago, he sewed it on. He cut the shell and put it on there.
Don't buy it from Joanne's Fabric, or you're gonna be broke. There is a magazine that I think it's called Cut and Sew magazine. They sell shell buttons and they sell abalone shell buttons, but they're pretty brittle. So that's something you have to kind of watch for too. The small buttons are pretty brittle. They're kind of curved so that possibly it got sat on or something would break.
I actually have some buttons for sale if anybody's interested.
You have information on buttons?
You sell them buttons?
Yeah. See
I
that?
have buttons for
See
sale.
her back there?
I have abalone, I have mother of pearl, I have a koya, and I have blue mussel shells actually. Yeah. And a nice beautiful shawl that I made.
They used to have a store called Black Elk in Anchorage, where they were costly to buy a few things. I used to buy the big dentalium shell buttons, but now they're gone. But my dad used to have these shells for adding to his carvings, whatever he was making. I was talking to him one time and he said that abalone shell in Alaska are very small and brittle, and it's very hard to use it in artwork. So where did they go to get it, do you know? Get the big shells? California. They would go down to California and the Indians down there really liked those abalones, but they would pile up the shells on the beach. And here comes the Clinkets to grab, to bring it back to use for their artwork. So we used a lot, and you start looking through the old books, the headdresses, the different clothes have lots of abalone, really heavy duty. Anyway, I don't know if they have abalone shells on the beach anymore, but that's the way we used to get it. Okay, are we done? Abunagao saya. If you haven't seen my vest yet with beadwork, take a look at it. I think it'll give you ideas as to how to